The only thing that East and West had in common by the 8th or the 9th century was the agreement that Constantinople was the city, the great marketplace, the focus of the Christian and the trading world. Constantinople had paved streets that ran for miles. It was lined by arcades full of countless shops with running water in every quarter, with a hippodrome greater than the Colosseum, and 4 gilded horses above the emperor's box, which were later stolen by the Venetians to adorn the facade of their basilica. And above everything, the wonder of Santa Sofia, the great cathedral which had been rebuilt by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century after the previous church had been burnt down in a riot. The harbor was crowded, the bazaars were full of people and goods from all over the world. As one visitor explained in 1161, great stir and bustle prevails in Constantinople in consequence of the conflux of many merchants who resort there both by land and sea from all parts of the world, from Babylon and Mesopotamia, from Media and Persia, from Egypt and Palestine, from Russia and Hungary, and from the West. You can get a vague idea of what it was like by looking at the site today, or by looking at architecture which imitates the Byzantine style from the domes of churches in Moscow to this one in Périgueux in France, and by looking at Venice, where St. Mark's is the 11th century copy of a 6th century Byzantine church, and where many of the palaces are touched by the Byzantine style. But in the 9th and 10th centuries, when Constantinople was the wonder of Christendom, the West was backward. It didn't have much to offer the East in exchange for its silks and spices. A bit of iron and timber, slaves who were mostly captured or kidnapped Slavs, hence the term slave, and eventually woolen textiles which would improve the balance of trade. But for a long time, the Byzantines despised Westerners as barbarians, which they were, and as poor barbarians, which was worse. And the Westerners despised Byzantines as effeminate, devious, and wicked. They ate fancy food, they wore fancy clothes, they washed far too much, and the women painted themselves, and the men hired other men to fight for them. So Westerners looked down on Byzantines, but they also envied their riches. And this attraction which drew them to the glamour and the splendor of Constantinople was dangerous, because if all roads led to the city, to New Rome, then everybody was likely to wind up there with fair intentions or foul. The Byzantine Empire had already been beset by a number of pressures, from the Turks in Anatolia, the Normans in Italy and Greece, and especially the Italian sea powers, Genoa, Pisa, and Venice. Finally, in 1202, Venice convinced some 30,000 crusaders who were unable to pay for transport to Muslim Egypt to conquer Venice's rebel Christian port city Zara instead. The pirate crusaders then moved on to Constantinople with the flimsiest of excuses, and they took the city in 1204. This is an artist's rendering of the event done a long time later. And this is Venice, which was the primary beneficiary when the Byzantine Empire, its riches and trade fell into Western hands. It was Venice that went on to dominate the Eastern Mediterranean. And the shadow of the Byzantine Empire that survived disappeared in 1453 when the Turks delivered the coup de grace by capturing Constantinople. You can imagine then how difficult it was for the people of Constantinople to live in a pot of honey when the land was full of wasps. Towards the end of the empire, the life of the average East Roman was a life of care. They were afraid of the ruthless tax collector, of the arbitrary tyranny of the imperial governor, of the devouring land hunger of the powerful, of the recurrent menace of barbarian invasion. It's to the credit of the Byzantine world, to the credit of the tradition of Christian charity and social justice, which it often incorporated, that it realized this burden of fear and perennial danger and tried to lighten it by building hospitals for the sick, for lepers, for the disabled, by building hostels for pilgrims like these and strangers and old people, by building maternity homes for women and refuges for abandoned children and the poor, well-endowed institutions with elaborate charters telling just how they were to be administered. The Byzantines listened to the texts they heard in church, one of which inspired the future St. Anthony to become a hermit. If you would be perfect, go sell all you have and give to the poor, and come follow me. Many people followed this advice, and they did it the more readily since in the insecurity of their time, material goods could come and go very quickly anyway. Life was insecure and dangerous, and religious vocations, as well as outbreaks of violence and cruelty, were the natural consequence. The world of our own time ought to make it easier for us to understand the passions of the Byzantine world, the problems it faced, the fears under which it labored, and the simple feat of endurance it performed. Because finally, that's what remains, the historic function of Constantinople as the outpost of Europe against the invading hordes of Asia. Under the shelter of that defense of its eastern gateway, Western Europe could refashion its own life. And it's hardly an exaggeration to say that the civilization of Western Europe is a byproduct of the will of the Byzantine Empire to survive.